with reports of a variety of targets being missed as part of the Housing for All plan, is the ambitious project already beginning to falter? Is the failure to address issues around short-term lets, affordable housing, vacant properties and increased funding for the Residential Tenancies Board a sign of the plan's ineffectiveness? Well, I'm joined now by Social Democrats TD for Dublin Bay North, party spokesperson on housing, Cian O'Callaghan, and we'll be joined by the CEO of O'Callaghan Co-Housing Alliance, Hugh Brennan. Good morning and welcome. Cian, I've been reading the story which is across the front of the Irish Independent, and really it is a list of delays. It points to a huge sluggishness in the whole system.
It does, and the housing crisis is having a huge effect at the moment on people's lives. It's causing massive distress. There's more than almost 11,000 people who are homeless living in emergency accommodation, more than 3,000 children, having a huge impact on their development in terms of childhood trauma and all the other effects that it has. So seeing things that should be relatively straightforward, such as properly regulating short-term lets, and seeing that not being done and not acted on yet, it is very hard to understand how some of the kind of easier to do things on the government's list haven't been done yet.
Let's parse each of those things. I mean, Airbnb, you're supposed to basically get permission to be an Airbnb if you've got a whole house in Airbnb. What is the situation with the register at the moment?
Well, there is no register in place. So the situation is that over the last number of years, if you're in a rent pressure zone, which is, all the cities and other parts of the country, you're meant to apply for a change of use if you're changing from a home or a rental property into a short-term let. And in Dublin, for example, across the Dublin 4 local authorities, since 2019, there's only been 22 planning permission applications for change of use.
And you don't believe that?
Well, only six of those were granted. Well, it's estimated that there's at least about 5,000 short-term lets operating in Dublin without planning permission. So they're not registered. They're in defiance of the planning laws.
Who's responsible for knocking on those doors and finding out who the landlord is and how they should be penalised? And what is the punishment?
Yeah, well, the current system, I think, was a system designed to fail. So it's around planning enforcement. It's not effective. What's done well in other cities is the onus is put on the platform, for example, that you cannot, if you're Airbnb or any other platform, you cannot advertise a short-term let on your website unless it's planning compliant. And
all right,
so you'd have to,
you can't drive a taxi unless you have a taxi license.
And when you upload your photos and the other information, you have to upload the document showing that you've got the planning permission or the planning consent, or indeed a planning exemption if that's what's relevant. So the onus should be on the platforms. This should have been done years ago. Should be done now, okay. and we're still waiting on this to be done.
So, I mean, you're suggesting that would simply be the stroke of a pen. Is it really, though, because all the constitutional issues surrounding the right of a property owner to pretty much do what he or she likes with their property, sell it, rent it, leave it lie fallow? Well,
certainly there's been no constitutional challenges to the legislation to date, which does require people to apply for planning permission for a change of use. So that hasn't been disputed. What is the issue is the system put in place is completely ineffective, and that was really known at the time. And I mean, just to give a
so it's the local authority would have to kind of police this.
Yeah, but it's true planning enforcement, a complaint having to be made, all those sorts of things. And it's not
anyone who has had experience of trying to get planning enforcement. I know in Dublin City Council area, for example, someone built an extension that was in breach of. It was in the Sandymount area, called Dublin City Council Enforcement. No action at all.
Yeah, if you're trying to design a system that's not going to work on short-term lets, they went about it the right way, and that's why having a different system requiring all of these short-term lets to be registered and requiring the platform to have proof that it's planning compliant when advertising it is a good way to go. Just to give a bit of context on this, on the census night there was 35,000 rental homes empty throughout the country. That's a massive amount of rental homes, and a lot of those would be short-term lets. It effectively is, for a lot of property owners, it can be more economical to have a property empty some of the time, but to rent it for short-term lets than to do a long-term rental. And that's why in other countries they've regulated this, because it can be disastrous not to regulate.
Isn't there something else as well, that landlords who are, we're told, leaving the market in droves, selling up because of the restrictive rules that are being brought in and so on and so forth, or that's how they perceive it, that landlords... there's no risk with a squatting tenant or a tenant who doesn't pay their bill if it's a short-term let through a platform like Airbnb. There's no risk.
Yeah, and I think actually this relates to one of the other issues that's mentioned in the analysis on Housing for All, is the extra resources that were promised for the Residential Tenancies Board so it could do its job more effectively, haven't been delivered on. And that is
No,
very
but I mean,
important.
put yourself, you are a landlord for a moment. Just imagine this. And you can get either maybe £2,000 a month for your 2-bedroomed apartment, or you can get £2,000 a month by letting it for 5 or 6 days in that month. Which would you do?
And this is absolutely why it has to be regulated, because if you don't regulate and put a limit on the amount of short-term lets in any area, it becomes a dominant form of supply and displaces others. I mean, there's a real issue, particularly in more touristy parts of the country, you know, places in Kerry where new housing estates were built to meet local housing need. And if you now go to them, you'll see that the entire housing estate is holiday homes and the entire housing estate is short-term lets, because there's a better, someone buying that house to rent it out as a short-term let can afford to pay a much higher price than any local person will ever be able to pay to buy a home. And that is just, you know, so, and look, there's nothing wrong with having some short-term lets.
Do you know the way Dublin City is bringing in rules
it
now, in spite of the planning regulators' objections to the amount of apartments that can be built solely for rent? There will be have to be a significant proportion of them will be made available for sale. The government and the regulator will scream and say, no, we need more houses to rent, and this will stop the funds coming in and all that sort of stuff. But Dublin City Council have decided in their wisdom for the next county development plan, that's what they're going to do.
And I think they're right to do that. So you have to regulate and have a balance on this. You have to have people in Kerry who have as much right to be able to access housing as anyone else. Of course, you will have tourist lets, short-term lets. Of course, in Dublin City, you're going to have rental properties. But the issue is that home ownership has been declining heavily over the last number of years.
I know I'm bringing up contradictions all the time, and this shows how little joined-up thinking there is. So you build a house, and let's say the planning system says that this is for owner-occupier. In the long term, maybe short term, you go away to Dubai as a teacher and you come back. So you want to earn a bit of money on your property while you're away. That might be fair enough. But you decide that the planning permission is for an owner-occupier, blah, blah, blah. And then the government says, yeah, but you can rent a room in your house and get 14 grand tax-free. So you become a landlord sort of to suit the government and not a landlord when it doesn't suit the government.
Yeah, I think there is a big difference between rent a room and renting out full properties. And I think, look, it is useful when people rent out rooms, even for part of the year, to students or to anyone else. That is helping to meet some housing needs.
But you see the thing, Airbnb, you need a license to do that. You don't need a license to have a student in for, say, 6 months of the year.
To be clear, in terms of regulating short-term lets, this is about whole properties, entire apartments, entire homes. And it's really about homes that were long-term rental properties being turned into short-term rental. This isn't about trying to regulate or clamp down on Airbnbs or short-term lets where it's a room in a house. That creates additional supply, additional use, and that doesn't create a disruptive
other things
effect.
That are mentioned here. The idea of, and I know you'd be in favour of buying up vacant properties. Now, there are lots of reasons why properties are vacant, like in probate. They've eased the rules on the fair deal scheme and so on. But still, there are lots of reasons why a property might be vacant. But if there's no particular reason, buy them, compulsory purchase them. Is that what you would support?
It's certainly effective. I think, more effective is having a strong tax rate on vacant homes where there isn't a good reason. You've listed off a lot of good reasons, and there should be exemptions in those. But the vacant homes tax they're talking about is far too low, actually. I think it's just 0.3% of the value of the home to actually be effective. But also, yes, where there's a home that's lying empty for years, if it's vacant, if it's derelict, should councils be CPOing them and getting them back into use?
Now, CPO is a very tortuous, long process.
Yeah, they are. And one of the things that's been done well in other countries is, rather than the whole long CPO process, is something called a compulsory sales order. So if you are sitting on a vacant property for no good reason, you can actually be forced then to sell that to get it back into use. And that cuts out the council having to go through years of CPOing.
Okay. A much simpler process. You're not using it, sell it, either refurb it and open it for business, or sell it. Yeah,
and we need to start looking at, every home has a huge amount of public investment in it in terms of the infrastructure, the water infrastructure, transport, roads, amenities. So having an empty home in an area with all of that public investment having it sitting empty for no good reason, that actually comes at a huge cost. And it is the value of that home, even if it's been neglected, has been contributed to publicly as well as the private element of it.
Yeah, I saw in the papers about the vacant site levy, and the councils are all advertising now for people to fess up and so on and so forth. So that's happening.